Our last guest for today is Esmat El Halaby, a historian of transnational Asia. His research focuses on the intellectual history of decolonization, particularly that of West and South Asia. El Halaby is currently a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Davis. He was previously a Humanities Research Fellow at NYU Abu Dhabi and received his PhD in history from Rice University in 2019. He joins us from California. One of the things I found in your writing, digging into your research in your archive, is the notion of area studies. And it seems to really kind of sort of define as a sort of umbrella a lot of the research and archival and academic work you've done. Could you maybe just start off by giving us an introduction on what area studies means in your work?
So at the most basic level, area studies is one of the things that I aim to target in the kinds of research that I do. I mean, I've written a lot about what area studies is, in particular in the American Academy or the Western Academy in general, and mostly to expose its limits, right? So my own research tries to think outside the frame of area studies. And in order to do that, I think it's important to think about the origins of this particular form of knowledge, right? Which is not at all something you can separate from both the longer history of the social sciences and the humanities in general, especially the history of philology and ethnology as it relates to the colonization of the world, and the specific histories of states in the 20th century and how they sought to produce knowledge about the world in order to become part of something like an international community, right? So everyone basically agreed on specific terms of development of social scientific fact and tried to develop similar institutions. So you find all over the world at this point centers for the studies of various areas, right? But this comes at a particular moment in the 19th century in Europe and is then exported elsewhere. You know, it's generally understood in the history of the United States that the US becomes an empire only with the Spanish-American War and the US conquest of the Philippines and the island of Cuba and other territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, right? This late 19th century moment is seen as the inauguration of US empire. But what a lot of historians have tried to argue recently, and certainly indigenous intellectuals or Native American intellectuals in the United States have argued for a long time, is that this is a question, that this territorial expansion that is naturalized both in the moment of the conquest of North America by the US government and its agents, and is naturalized in the historiography. So in general, you have this break that the empire only begins with an imperialism that goes beyond the shores of North America. This is sort of, this has become a major problem. And one thing, and I think it's important to recognize that this territorial expansion is an imperial expansion, right? And so if you look at the history of California as part of this US empire, this place where you are this particularly settler formation where you are exterminating huge amounts of the native population, right? An extermination that had begun hundreds of years before, right? With the Spanish conquest, but in the 19th century is particularly bloody and egregious because of the sheer firepower of the settlers and the U.S. government, and the particular economic conditions, including the gold rush, and a rush in general for all sorts of minerals, right? California becomes a huge site of, mineral extraction, mining, and logging, right? So you have, they cut down all these redwood trees and build California, basically. This all takes place in the 19th century, and one thing that I'm trying to argue, basically, is that, and I'm not the only or the first person to argue this, that these forms of knowledge that are being produced in this moment, ethnological, philological knowledge about Native American tribes, etc., is inexorably tied, both in terms of who finances it, who conducts it, and in terms of where it's taking place and the particular geographical situation, the conditions, tied to studies of Asia, for example, right? So if you look at the founding of universities like the University of California, Berkeley, or Stanford, which are founded around the same time in the 19th century, these are universities that, of course, built on land expropriated from Native Americans with money made from mining and other ventures in California and the West in general, or the Western United States in general, including the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Transcontinental Telegraph, etc., forms of infrastructure and communication essential to both the continental empire and the overseas empire, and through the exploitation of imported unfree labor from many places, and especially China, right? So these histories are connected, and that's, I think, very important to understand if you are working on the non-West in a place like the United States.
And that tied into your research in a way where seeing the narrative sort of formation and production through the establishment that exists between, let's say, the ivory tower, the state apparatus, and sort of big business that reinforces itself in that way. On this note of this pool of knowledge, and before we get to the 1960s and what started to emerge, that I found in a lot of your recent work and your recent research, maybe you can begin by talking to us about this very unique and interesting period of relations between Asian Indian history and emerging late 19th century politics in the Levant. What sort of forces combined to make the events of Lebanon in 1860 reflective of 1857 events in India, and how does that sort of lead into what we're going to talk about, which is the Indo-Arab relations that start to emerge in the 1960s?
So one of the arguments that I have tried to make, and this is an attempt to both think comparatively and in terms of real historical connections, and this is something that a lot of good historians of Asia and colonialism and capitalism these days are thinking about, is the extent to which, and this of course draws heavily on older studies, whether it's world systems theory or other kinds of attempts to think holistically about the transformations in the political and social conditions of the world in the 19th century and the centuries prior, because of the expansion of capitalism and the expansion of Europe in the world. The Taiping Rebellion, for example, of the 1850s into the 60s, that takes place in China, that almost ends the Qing Empire. The historian Rebecca Carl has called this China's forced entry into a new phase of the formation of the capitalist world system. This is because basically British intervention puts down this rebellion and allows the Qing Empire to survive in some form for a few more decades, right? But this is done basically at the expense of China's sovereignty.
This is during
right?
Queen Victoria's rule, right? This is what a
Yeah.
lot of people maybe might know about, something to do with the Opium Wars that would develop. And
Exactly, right. So this is the same time, this is the same dynamic, right? And this loss of Chinese sovereignty, which is also, of course, taking place in India at roughly the same time, 1857, you have a rebellion and you have a shift in the form of rule in South Asia. No longer is ruling India the prerogative of the East India Company, this corporation, but rather it is the English state itself, which takes on this role directly, which comes with its own consequences. And you also have a similar set of events taking place in the 1860s in the Ottoman Empire, right? And in particular in the Levant. So the rebellion of 1860 or civil war in Mount Lebanon, as well as similar events in Damascus and elsewhere, also led to new treaties with the Ottoman Empire, new forms, a loss of sovereignty on the part of the Ottomans, right? This all takes place in roughly the same time in the middle of the 19th century, the culmination of a longer history and also a history that would transform. So forms of colonial rule, I'm not arguing for some kind of continuity, right? There are very important distinctions between how India is ruled and how the Levant is ruled. And the Levant is very different from the state of Egypt, which in the 1890s comes under direct colonial rule of Britain in a certain kind of way, and rule over China, etc. Right? There are very important distinctions to be made. What's clearly the same is that all of these are coming from the same dynamics, right? And you can talk about a colonial frame that is both right, that is premised entirely on local collaboration with older forms of patronage and older forms of knowledge persisting beyond this period, but nevertheless, you're looking at the introduction of new forms of knowledge and new social relations in terms of who is working under what conditions and where, right? And this the same kinds of imperial networks that allow the British Empire to import labor from certain parts of its empire, or import certain forms of both forms of labor and laborers themselves to other parts of their empire, also allow certain intellectuals from these places to travel across these imperial networks. And of course, this culminates in the 20th century with the kinds of anti-colonial friendships and formations that are forged in European capitals, whether it's Berlin or Paris or London, when suddenly you have people from all over Asia and Africa meeting for the first time in ways that they never could have in previous centuries because of their shared experience of colonialism.
They might have met, and in fact, in the research, there are moments of intersection, and there are journalists or editors, academics who travel to India from the Levant.
Right. So one of the things that I try to track is these earlier interactions in the 19th century, especially in the late 19th century, as travel becomes a little bit easier for some and harder for others. Now, you have a long history of interaction between South and West Asia, the Arab world, and the Indian subcontinent, and beyond. The Indian Ocean in general, of course, was a major site of Arab seafaring, as medieval histories will show us, which of course also produced all kinds of important forms of knowledge, including a huge body of Arabic geographical knowledge of the Indian Ocean and its coasts. Now, what I argue is that in the 19th century, you have different forms of knowledge and different kinds of travelers going along these much older routes that were once the domain of the ulama, scholars who used to move, regularly between South Asia and the Hijaz, for example, and other centers of Islamic learning in the Middle East, as well as traders, right, who also regularly or not so regularly would actually settle in different parts of the Indian Ocean world, whether coastal India or Hyderabad or parts of Southeast Asia like Indonesia or Singapore, where you have these kinds of networks produced that are both business networks and genealogical networks and knowledge of and intellectual networks.
So what you're saying is there's the emergence of a new traveler, and that's the scholar.
The scholar, a different kind of businessman, it's a different person. So it's not necessarily someone who's part of either a Muslim family that has ties across this Indian Ocean or a non-Muslim family, right? The Indian Ocean also had, non-Muslim sort of trading diasporas, as they're sometimes called, like the Armenians and others. You had individuals, just like you had, the birth of the explorer or whatever in Europe, who goes out and, is able to take the British Empire's ships to far-flung places and write about it and find manuscripts and meet Orientals. You have Arabs in this period, Christians who wouldn't necessarily be part of the same ulama networks, traveling to India, also in search of knowledge or employment, etc. Right? And this is different from
they're leaving from Beirut. They're leaving from places in the Levant.
Beirut, other parts of the Levant, Egypt, certainly, different places where you have this kind of where the British Empire or other European empires have a presence that are moving in that direction. Of course, this history is a little bit different in Iraq, for example, where you have a longer set of interactions, and you have, for example, a long history of Iraqi Jews who had migrated to South Asia in the centuries prior, right? So these histories are different in different places, but someone like Wadi Albustani, who I write about, this guy who's born at the very end of the 19th century in a little town in Mount Lebanon called Dibiyah, going off to India to, meet Tagore and write, and then later produce translations of Indic texts. This wouldn't have happened, right? 100 years before. A Maronite from this particular location would not have been able. The conditions simply were not there for him to know that there was something interesting there for him to learn about and study, and to find a way there through Egypt, through Yemen, through employment with the British Raj and with Khaliji merchants, right? So this is what I'm talking about, that this something that would have previously been impossible became possible under these conditions.
What is he in pursuit of?
So someone like Bustani is interesting, and this, of course, is not uncommon. So unlike someone like Luis Chejo, who's like really an antiquarian and wants to find, just like he's heard French and other European Orientalists go to India and find all these Arabic and Persian manuscripts and then are able to produce new histories and new editions and stuff. He's reading this stuff and he's like, you know what? I'm going to leave Beirut. and I'm going to go to India and try to find some manuscripts. Bustani's motivations are slightly different in the sense that he is not an antiquarian, not a bibliographer. He's a romantic poet, basically, who's imbibed a certain kind of, sense that there is a canon of world literature that can be translated and shared with an Arabic reading public, right? He's writing before he goes to India for Arabic publications in Egypt and elsewhere, and he's bored basically of his duties as someone who's literate in English and French. He went to AUB, Syrian Protestant College in Beirut, American University Beirut, as it's called now, and worked for the British in Egypt and later Yemen, and then goes to India. And in India, he doesn't work for the British, he works for this Kuwaiti merchant. But while there, again, he's not interested in the kind of work that he's doing, which is like bookkeeping. And he goes to Tagore, and Tagore's just won the Nobel Prize. He sits with Tagore. He's a poet himself, Bustani. He speaks with the students, tells them about the contemporary affairs of the Levant and Egypt. And he writes multiple articles about it for El Hilal, right, which is one of the most important journals of the period being published in Cairo. So his motivations are interesting, right? They are intellectual motivations. They're not simply ones that are. They're not. He's not a collector. He's not interested in finding old physical copies. He's really interested in the ideas, the texts themselves, what they can teach.
And in relation to someone like Sheikho,
yeah,
who's searching for something perhaps more tangibly valuable, is these manuscripts. Is it an economic drive of some sort, or is it a matter of prestige? Or what's happening back home at the time that makes them want to pursue these items?
It's certainly not an economic thing. It might be a question of prestige. Of course, at this point, you have libraries that are growing, private libraries, university libraries that are growing, none bigger than the European manuscript libraries, of course. But Sheikho had a particular intellectual project. It was a conservative project, both politically and in its methods. This is a man who studied in France, who was very much a part of a different kind of global network, which was the Jesuit network, which is very important for understanding basically the how forms of knowledge become global, because everywhere the Jesuits were, and this takes place long before the 19th century, you have new forms of study, etc. So that's his background. He's a Jesuit trained in France, coming from the Jazeera region, who is really interested in producing serious collections of medieval and pre-medieval Arabic Christian literature, right? So he's witnessing this rise of Arabism in the Levant, right? And an idea that Arabic is an important glue for the society. And he's like, well, we should produce, I know that Arabic is not simply a language of Islam. It is, a language that a lot of Christian writers and scholars produce all kinds of work for many centuries in. So let me produce scholarly editions of manuscripts and collections of writings. And this is what he's trying to do. And he's on the hunt for manuscripts that will help him do that very specific philological work
Right.
and his literary historical work.
Can you tell us about the events of the 1960s in the intellectual sphere of Asian studies and how a reclamation of narrative began to take place? Also thinking of the words that you cite of Ahmed Mustafa Abu Hakima during the seminar in India and the Arab world in April 1965.
Let me quote Abu Hakima, who's a Palestinian historian who at the time I think was in Amman, but would teach elsewhere, including in Tanzania, I believe. And he's at this seminar, which is being convened by a number of scholars of West Asia in India, including this guy, M.S. Alwani, this historian, Maqbul Ahmed. And it's a quite interesting event that takes place in 65 at the Indian Council of Cultural Relations. And so in his remarks, Abu Hakima says, "When I was in the UK, unfolding the papers of the East India Company at the India Office Library, London, my Indian friends and research scholars working on various subjects there were not astonished to see an Arab research student working on papers considered their personal historical property. But the English put questions such as, 'Have you come to write your history in London from English records? What relations could be revealed from Indian English sources?' Of course, I did not blame them, because Indo-Arab relations were not seen in the light this meeting sees them." Right? Now, Abu Hakima was a historian of the Gulf in general and Kuwait in particular, right? And so now the Gulf, for especially the second half of the 19th century, and certainly from the second half of the 19th century until essentially the middle of the 20th century, was under a kind of indirect rule of the British Empire, right? And the India Office in particular. And so the India Office records obviously have a wealth of material having to do with the history, the 19th and 20th century history of the Gulf, right? And this is something that, of course, now Gulf countries have recognized, and there's huge efforts to digitize these particular records from the India Office, being funded by Qatar and other countries in the Gulf. But Abu Hakima's anecdote, right, which is that, you know, when he's in the archives, you know, his Indian colleagues recognize that this is a shared history, right? That these materials speak to a shared history, right? A colonial history in particular. But the English employees at the archive aren't, right? Because for them, it's India. India, simply, the India Office comports exactly with contemporary India. Therefore, this is the domain of Indian historians and people interested in the territory of India, or, you know, a larger sort of India-Pakistan territory at the time this is happening, right? And I think this is important, and this is what I was trying to get at earlier, is that while you have a kind of revolt on the part of students and young teachers and radical intellectuals in the West against the racial and imperial attitudes of their own Orientalist teachers, right, in Asian studies, in Middle East studies, etc., in the 60s. In the Middle East, you've had this going on for decades, right? From even the beginning of the 20th century or before, you've long had a recognition, certainly even in the 19th century, that writing about Asia from the West was the product of particular imperial attitudes, right? And so it was condescending, it was anti-Muslim, it was this and that, and this often took the form of polemics against specific missionary tracts or particular imperial tracts, whether in South Asia or in West Asia. You have a huge amount of this material. There's a famous case is Al-Afghani's response to Ernest Renan about, the Muslim mind and Muslim science and so on, right? So this is taking place in the 19th century. Now, by the middle of the 20th century, where you have, universities in Asia that are essentially in the same form as universities that you could find in Europe or the United States, with various departments of social science and humanities and so on. And you have people who are like, okay, we've been bequeathed this system, but we're over here teaching histories of Europe. We're still invested in European histories and so on. And that is still the priority, both in terms of what theory we're, social and political theory we're engaging in, and also the particular histories and the particular archives that we have access to and so on. And you have intellectuals in this period, in Asia, in India, and in the Arab world, who are like, you know what, we need to do it differently, right? We need to think on our own terms. We need to recognize that we have this shared history, both a shared colonial history and a pre-colonial history that has been forgotten and disappeared in part because of these colonial conditions, right? And they do that, and they do it, to the best of their abilities.
And what sort of interesting or perhaps radical or imaginary ideas were proposed, or what's something that we can sort of grab on, or maybe even research, if people are listening and they're interested in what might have been discussed in the intersection of Asian and South Asian and West Asian intellectuals of the time. This was obviously an era marked by a sort of extreme division, even in Europe, of the left and the right.
Yeah. Sure. I don't wholly agree with your distinction, but I do get what you're saying, and I think this period was a very important one for new forms of thinking on the part of intellectuals in the colonized world. I don't generally write about particularly radical people. Some of the people I do are, but in general, they're kind of they're certainly anti-imperial and anti-colonial, but oftentimes, they are at odds with the kinds of social transformations that the most radical intellectuals of their milieu would share, right? Nevertheless, I do want to think a little bit about the contemporary situation, our contemporary situation, with regards to this work that I've been doing, in part because it's become very, very popular these days, although under much contestation, certainly by reactionaries, to decolonize, right, at a cultural level. Right? And this has been taking place, of course, with regards to public statues and memorials, to reading lists, syllabi, university departments, a whole host of things, right? Museums, certainly. There has been a demand to decolonize, right? And this has been seen to a certain extent as a novel gesture, right? Now, of course,
right.
You can't separate this from the efforts of indigenous intellectuals and activists in settler colonies, whether Australia or the United States, etc. They, of course, there's a particular genealogy to their calls for decolonization. There, especially in Canada, you have robust kind of intellectual culture around what necessarily decolonization means and so on. I'm not trying to criticize that, but the general thrust of it in a discipline like Middle East studies, for example, or with regards to colonial forms of history writing or research, whether in anthropology or elsewhere, of West and South Asia or other parts of Asia. This call to decolonize as if it's some kind of novel thing is really ahistorical. And, it ignores the contributions and the attempts to decolonize in other names and in other forms by Arab and Indian intellectuals, for example, in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, right? They were trying to decolonize, right? They literally, in the original sense of the term, right? This was the era of decolonization, of political decolonization, right? Which we know to have been incomplete and mired with all sorts of difficulties, right? Nevertheless, at the intellectual, cultural level, what took place, including in these institutions of learning. So I'm not simply talking about, radical poets and radical novelists, etc., who are obviously, I think, on the forefront of this kind of cultural decolonization, but even people within universities, within learned societies, and so on, in the colonized world in the 40s and 50s and 60s, were constantly talking about the need to think beyond Europe in the writing of history, in research, and they were critical, of course. You had movements for the repatriation of artifacts and manuscripts from Europe, right, back to Asia, right? This was taking place then, not on the part of intellectuals in the US. At that time, intellectuals in the US, for the most part, certainly white intellectuals who dominated these fields of various studies, Orientalism, ethnology, philology, and so on, couldn't care less about this sort of work, right? For them, Europe was the center, and even though they worked on Asia. But for Asian intellectuals, they recognized the structural challenges to doing the serious scholarly work that they wanted to do, right? They understood that they had their own universities and libraries, right? The British were out of India, but somehow they didn't have the manuscripts that had long resided in India to do the kind of scholarly work that they wanted to do, right? Those manuscripts had been carted off to the British Library, to Oxford, to Cambridge, and so on, right? And so they made demands constantly. And if you look at their papers and you look at their the proceedings of conferences and so on for redress, right? That this was not this clearly unequal state of affairs was preventing them from doing the intellectual work that they wanted to do, right? This was decolonizing long before there was all this kind of talk today.
So if we're talking about today, and in a world where much of this has probably been archived, I'm assuming online, and if not, I mean, it wouldn't be as difficult to have access to the sort of works that maybe one needs in their research. What is happening today in that sense, in that taking all of that into account?
I mean, the situation for intellectuals in the colonized or formerly colonized world today is, I think, much worse than it's ever been, right? It's actually harder to do serious intellectual work now than it was in the 50s and 60s. Now, of course, much more people have access to university education, etc., but because of all sorts of reasons, right? Whether it's structural readjustment and the demands of global capital on these non-sovereign states, essentially, whether in the Middle East or in Asia, or it's the rise of chauvinist attitudes, right-wing attitudes against the writing of serious scholarly histories, that prevents a lot of people from doing this work, and also, or the hardening of visa regimes and the difficulty of accessing all sorts of material, or the reality of slow broadband and insufficient electricity during the day to access the things that have been digitized, right? So there are a lot of structural conditions that prevent people in the colonized world to do the work that they certainly should and could be doing, right? Certainly the work that I do on this very history could not be done very easily if I was in a university in the Arab world today.
In the work, there's a figure, Clovis Maxwell, who's of the belief that there are three things in particular that should bring Indians and Arabs together: socialism, secularism, and non-alignment. His quote that we have begun to know each other through each other, what you define as reflective of third worldism, Afro-Asianism, large epistemological projects of the time, portrays an era that feels rich in opportunity and possibility. Now, you also end one of your pieces with this passage, and I'm just going to read it, if that's all right. It is clear that the era of decolonization, however titular it turned out to be, was marked by profound changes in how Arabs and Indians interacted. The colonial frame, which had served as their primary linkage for at least 200 years, was broken. What was left had to create itself anew. Within a specific significant geography, particular idioms, texts, and past could be summoned for use in a project oriented toward the future. It was, in the end, a failed project. Alternatives, like the global Islam cultivated and nourished between the cracks of nations, regions, and minds, have proved to be far more resilient. But this Indo-Arab project, which was cultivated within the frame of non-alignment, which has received so little comparative attention, still offers valuable lessons. First and foremost, lessons for how to write its own past. So there are a couple pieces there that are interesting to carry on with the conversation. One being this notion of non-alignment, and another being this notion of secularism and socialism tying Indians and Arabs together, which is Maqsood's thesis. And the third being what you point to, which is the way that political Islam or global Islam that emerged after the 60s and 70s did create a new sort of project to connect major parts of the global South together in a way that perhaps contradicts the intentions of those earlier Indo-Arab secularists, I would assume, based on what I've been hearing.
So there's a lot there. Let me begin with Clovis Maxwell, right? So he's again from Lebanon. He is also a Maronite, right? So he's not a Muslim, which I think is important in this particular case, because he's giving these remarks and he writes this idea, he talks about this in a number of places and throughout his time in India and afterwards, that secularism, socialism, his own particular beliefs, which in part were inspired by his reading about the Indian freedom movement, right, and the movement of Gandhi and Nehru and so on, that these are important connections that need to be cultivated between the Middle East and South Asia, or what he would call the Arab nation, and India. And he acknowledges that the history, that the key to the older links, like I've discussed a little bit, was Islam, right? And he thinks now, however, Islam is not going to be sufficient enough rubric for linking the two regions in perpetuity, right? So for him, you have these new ideas, right? Secularism, socialism, these ideas that he's very much tied to. He studied, I think, in Cambridge, or might have been Oxford, I'm forgetting now, and also in the United States at George Washington University. And he spent a lot of time after his stint as the Arab League's ambassador to India in the United States first as the Arab League's ambassador to the United Nations, and later as a professor at the American University in Washington, D.C. So he has an interesting career that I could get into. But this statement that he makes in a couple different places and in a few different ways, I think is really essential to turn to, which is this idea of knowing each other through each other and not through others, right? This is precisely what today, 50, 60 years after Maqsood's, a lot of critical decolonial scholars and so on aim to do and argue we should try to do in our work. And here he is saying it in the heat of this moment, right? Recognizing that Europe is not going to allow you to really understand your own history, right, with each other, and also it's not going to be it's not the path to the future. Right, and this is something that a lot of Indian intellectuals also thought to be true, right? That we now have these new, nations with our own institutions, and we can make our own decisions about how we write about each other. Now, of course, this was a bigger than simply this particular cultural or historiographical project. Right, non-alignment, third worldism, etc. These were political projects, right? Sometimes deeply problematic, insufficient projects. Sometimes communist projects. Sometimes anti-communist projects. Right? There's a lot to the political history of this, and a lot of it is now being written and recognized. But it's these smaller histories, these intellectual and cultural histories of non-alignment and third worldism that I think can also aid us in writing history today as theories, right? So not simply, here's what Clovis Maxwell said, or here's what K.M. Panikkar said, and here's a history of these people. But actually, these, just like intellectuals in France and the United States were coming to new ideas about how to write history or when and for whom, these people were doing it. And we can use them to write our own histories, right? They themselves are theorists. They're not simply the subjects of our history.
On this notion, you're talking about Maqsood's ideas in that time. In a way, though, before we get to the idea of the socialism, secularism, and non-alignment, in a way, though, he was mistaken, because political Islam did emerge suddenly as a very strong force of consolidation. Am I correct?
Certainly. I mean, this I think is one of the key areas of research that I think a lot of scholars, some scholars are starting to look into, and a lot of people need to really look at the sources of this bifurcation, which I don't want to simply define as a bifurcation, right? Because you certainly have a lot of Muslims or politically Islamist people or whatever involved in movements, Afro-Asian movements, non-alignment type movements, both before and before those kinds of movements, right? So, but there is something to be said about the rise of U.S. imperial patronage and the role of the U.S. in places like Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia, but also the role of anti-communism, right, in squashing political movements that were so-called secular, right? And not just anti-communism, right? Just in general, you can talk about the events of Indonesia, where you have, the purging of communists, or in Iraq of the purging of communists, but also, for example, during the what could be called what is called the Bangladeshi War of Independence in 1971. The Pakistani state kills many Bangladeshi intellectuals and university teachers, right? Not communists necessarily, but the important generation of scholars, right? This is taking place all over the world. So you have to look at particular instances and the effect that has on an intellectual culture, as well as general transformations beyond simply the university and writing, but in terms of social movements and conditions of poverty and the conditions of the state. I mean, the Nasserist state, which is not entirely separate from decades of Egyptian state building, is also something that is essentially destroyed, right? So that leads to,
So
for the university and for regular Egyptians.
do you see it as a miscalculation that ultimately costs the project itself by not understanding the potential, some of the things that you mentioned? One, the emergence of the US as a sort of force empire and its relations to Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, what takes place in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and also Egypt in a post-Nasser era. All these things that end up shaping and reshaping the sort of what seemed to be in the 60s to be the global South or a third worldism that was sort of reliant on secular ideals to a degree, that perhaps it was a miscalculation not to see, for Maqsood and others, not to foresee what would emerge as a powerful force in the region, which would be a sort of Islamism, a common Islamism, and that miscalculating that actually costs the project that is of interest in a way.
That's a great question, and is giving me a lot to think about. I don't know if I quite have an answer yet, in part because I think this is actually a question that requires some research. I don't think it's simply a matter of miscalculation. That's for sure. This is, you have to look at what is being done just as much as you have to look at what is not being done. So what is being done on the part of, institutions, individuals, political parties, movements in Asia and parts of Africa with regards to promoting particular kinds of Islamic thought.
Right.
How is that not very different from what Christians in Europe or the United States are doing in similar time, right? I think what's important is to think about these histories as not exceptional, right? And there is a lot of anthropological and sociological work that looks at, the resurgence, what is seen as the resurgence of, religiosity or piety. I think a lot of that work has concluded that it's not really a matter of resurgence, right? This is about what are the, on the part of historians, social scientists, politicians, colonial administrators, etc., how are they seeing religion? What are they considering secular? What are they considering religious, etc.? This is what's determining their ideas of the future and their narrations of the past of particular societies and so on. So I think it's also a question of changing the terms of the debate and then trying to track particular moments, individuals, institutions that become significant, in which which disappear from significance, right? And that means really looking at a lot of material and trying to put it together in a lot of different languages, right? Because this is something that takes place worldwide and is both social transformation to one extent, something happening under an imperial frame and a Cold War context that is impossible to disentangle it from, and it's an intellectual project. So there are just a lot of different levels and different scales where it needs to be studied. And I don't think we actually have very many good answers yet.
Right. So, and this may be a sort of grand hypothetical, but based on the research, what do you believe which was left to potentially create itself anew? What do you believe remains possible? And not only academically and intellectually, not only socially and culturally, but is there a spiritual element that can redefine relations, perhaps, or codify or formalize relations in a way? There obviously, these are the archives you deal with and the research and the people you're dealing with. Obviously, a lot of them are, are after the pursuit of knowledge, but many are also, as you've mentioned, interested in social transformation and cultural and political transformation. To a degree, we are in an age today, an age of the paralysis of the imagination somehow. And I think a lot of people would be interested in someone who has dived into the sort of research that you have. If you think that there's something out there that has been formalized in language between these academics, or something that just requires a missing link, if there are futures that have been imagined, things that we can kind of codify and say, this is a vision that we have misplaced somehow in our archive.
That's a great question, and I'm not at all weary of talking about the future. It really is something that I care about. I don't do predictions, but I'm optimistic to a certain extent, because I do think anything is possible. That's an old idea, from Vico to Marx to Edward Said to all sorts of thinkers who have always understood that humans make their history under particular conditions, but they make history. And if you study the past, you can see that a lot of things were tried, right? And some things were successful, but the past is certainly always going to give you more and more examples of, or more reasons to keep thinking and inventing, right? And I see a lot of, and besides the work that I do and the historical work and archival work, I think is important, but it's also not the most important stuff. At the end of the day, there's remarkable stuff that takes place in the streets, right? This is something that people like C.L.R. James have long recognized, or recognized long ago, which was that in the act of trying to make something new, you come to new ideas, right? New ideas are produced in the crucible of this action, right? And I think that's essential to remember, that the more people are willing to involve themselves in intellectual, social, cultural movements that go against the really unlivable conditions of the present, right? For many people around the world.
Right.
That's what's going to produce the ideas. And this history is only going to serve as an example, right? Never a guide. The future will come from the new conditions, right? New content of thought emerges from changing conditions of thought, right? But these histories, things like, Indian intellectuals going to these meetings of Orientalists and raging against the fact that their manuscripts have been carted off to Europe and saying, you know what, forget this. We need an Oriental UNESCO, right? Something for us to preserve our heritage on our own terms, right? This, I think, is important only to give us some kind of inspiration and encouragement, right? To keep working at a future that's different from people should read old stuff not for the fun of it, or certainly if they want to have fun. I think there's a lot of fun to have it, but it's not, I don't subscribe to this kind of antiquarian attitude. I think the discipline of history, but also thinking about the past in general, it needs to be an active exercise.
I love the idea of new concepts stemming out of new conditions.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're very desperate for. I think that is a really remarkably simple way of explaining also what we're seeking in this modern era, which is new conditions, which is when sort of progressive or intellectually stimulated people from our generation are, raging against the machine, just demanding, new methods, new technologies to be part of the conversation, to bring reality to reality in a way, to bring it to the modern day.
Yeah.
That would include the sort of intellectual understanding that you're talking about, the conceptual understanding of how history has been written, how knowledge has been produced, and what alternatives exist and have already existed. It's a beautiful synthesis of what is possible and what is necessary. Before we close, I really want to talk a little bit about your, I guess, more personal archival work. I can imagine that as a researcher and as a historian, you have to go through an idea to get to the idea and to get to another idea.
Yeah.
And but maybe with a blog, you have the ability to put something out there, put an idea out there without it being sort of closed.
I often end up drawing on some of the stuff that I've posted on there over the years. I think, in the same way people keep journals of their notes or scraps of paper all over the place, or have whiteboards and stuff, it's one has to work. I think there are different dimensions of intellectual work that, back in the day, they say CLR James used to have like a huge Xerox machine in his house, in his apartment. Really, he wasn't very wealthy man, certainly at the end of his life, right? So this is someone that the copy machine, right? This thing that really has an amazing history in the history of social movements, becomes essential to the method, right? To the process of one's writing. And, CLR James was someone who wrote a lot of occasional pieces, right? He wasn't someone who simply wrote monographs, books. He was writing articles, at his most productive when he was involved in, all kinds of political questions in the 30s and 40s. He was writing articles, once a week, twice a week. Like he's just a huge, massive material. And so there are different, one has to work at different levels, right? Sometimes you write a short article about something and it's an eminent critique. It's not drawing from any kind of huge thing. It's just, this is a critique drawing on your own particular position and understanding of an issue, and that needs to be published right away, right? Other times you need to spend decades producing one work. And I think both are important and essential. So some of the stuff, I mean, most of these blog posts, I think most of them are written in, or posted in the matter of an hour, right? I come across something and I like it, and I'm like, oh, I should put this up, and I just put it up. You know what I mean?
And I find it wildly entertaining as well as enlightening. Pieces, on Edmund Wilson in Imperial San Diego, American tear gas in Hashemite Iraq, notes from an archival revolution, a 1974 article that was published entitled Jean-Paul Sartre shot rockets at the Palestinian Research Center's offices. You've dug into history and really managed to also find the visual accompaniment, and everything about it has a sort of aura of unmasking a sort of narrative that maybe has been misplaced or misconstrued, and it's whoever's interested, whoever's listening should really check it out along with your published work. Esmat, thank you very much. We've definitely taken up too much of your time, but I think there's just so much to get into, and we could probably make a serial format over this, because there's just so much that we need to first understand and then digest and then move on to synthesize. But really, really thankful and just really interesting stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dani.